Hello and welcome to the latest edition of the Tes International Podcast. I'm your host, Dan Worth. Today, we're chatting with Beth Kerr, the Global Director of Wellbeing for schools group Cognita. We chat about the challenge and opportunity of overseeing the wellbeing focus of 45,000 students and thousands of teachers in 10 countries around the world, from Brazil to Switzerland, India to Vietnam. And we discuss how to empower staff at all levels to feel comfortable looking out for pupil and colleagues' mental health, and of course, their own. Thank you so much for joining us for this latest Tes International Podcast. Really great to get your time. And obviously, we're going to be talking about wellbeing, which is a really big topic and a very important one this year, perhaps more than ever. To start with, why don't you just introduce yourself, a little bit about your role, and we can take it forward from there.
Yeah, so I am the Group Director for Wellbeing for Cognita. I come from a teaching background. I was a pastoral deputy just before I joined. I have worked in the state and independent sector from reception all the way up to year 13, so K-12. Been a moderator and an examiner, but in 2012, I felt that I was ill-equipped really to deal with the huge influx of mental health challenges that were coming through my doors. And so I did an MSc in child and adolescent mental health, which was unbelievably enlightening. And through that, I began working more with Cognita and then joined just a couple of years ago. And so now I oversee the well-being of about 45,000 students in nearly 10 countries. So it's a real exciting and ever-changing role.
Well, the scale of it certainly sounds like that. I mean, when you said 45,000 students in 10 countries, what countries, what regions are we talking about there?
So we have, in Europe, we have schools in Switzerland, in the UK and in Spain. In Latin America, we have schools in Chile and Brazil. And in Asia, we have schools in Singapore, Vietnam, Thailand, Hong Kong. I think that's all of them. Yes. So we have schools, really broad and diverse mix of schools. And I think it's important to say as well that the schools, Cognita schools are not, it's not sort of McDonald's version where it's you have the same type of school everywhere. We also, we take and we run schools that serve the local population. And in fact, we've recently also taken a school in India. So that was the one I forgot. Apologies.
Well, you remembered it at the end. That's all good. And no surprise that it's hard to remember them all when you've got such, like you said, a diverse sort of array of locations to cover. And maybe we can touch on that in a little moment. But I think everyone knows fundamentally that wellbeing is important. And, interesting that you went and did more research into it and more studying because you felt you needed to sort of keep be able to deal with it. Mm-hmm. So when we talk about wellbeing, though, it is such a common sort of word now. But what are we really talking about? What do we mean by that, particularly in your sort of setting? How do you interpret that as what you want to deliver to your schools, to your teachers, to your pupils?
Yeah, look, you're completely right. You're not trying to sell the concept of well-being to anyone. There is complete unity among colleagues, parents, across the world that it's important. But when I started, one of the things that was challenging, I suppose, is trying to make sure that I was talking about the same thing to multiple different colleagues in different languages with different curriculums and different populations. And so, the first job I felt really was to define what well-being was for us. And there are lots of different definitions of well-being. It's not saying that there's one right and one wrong, but for us, it was this sense of feeling content and flourishing socially, emotionally, and academically. And that was our definition, first of all. So that at least if you asked a child or a colleague, how is your well-being, they would have an idea of what I was asking them. And then the second thing, perhaps more importantly, was to know what things contribute to well-being. So we identified 6 things, 3 that contribute initially to physical health and 3 to mental health. But of course, there's this huge overlap because we know how intertwined physical and mental health, is. And so we said that for physical health, we looked at sleep, diet, and exercise, and for mental health, connecting, doing, and giving. And I hope that would be a really helpful point of reference for students. If they weren't feeling, if they said, well, I don't really feel content, I don't really feel okay, I'm definitely not flourishing, then you could say, okay, well, just look at these sorts of things. Do you see any gaps in these? And they might say, well, I haven't actually been sleeping that well, or I haven't really connected with anybody for a while, or I don't really do anything. I haven't got any hobbies. And so you have a basis for a conversation then, because sometimes well-being can be a sort of nebulous concept, and you're trying to sort of define it. And it's very difficult then to try and think you can improve it. And I don't like the idea that people think well-being, either you've got it or you haven't got it. That's not the case. I think it's a conscious thing that you have to do to ensure that you do have positive well-being. So that charter for us, if we called it our Be Well Charter, and that was absolutely transformational for me in having these conversations across all these schools.
And when you were coming up with those sort of definitions, how easy or how hard was that to do, again, within the context of your, what the work you do in the countries and schools you have to think about, did you have to think about, well, will that translate? Will that sort of terminology make sense to certain schools, or are that, were that all the ones you chose? They were like, yeah, that will make sense and can be implemented by everyone.
Well, we sought information from international organisations, of course, didn't sort of come up with it, the World Health Organization and other international organisations. And it's also then a dialogue with our colleagues in these countries. And you're right, the actual terminology was important. And so being sure that sleep means sleep in these different countries was key. And trying to keep it simple. I think sometimes you overcomplicate it. So it was those three things of looking at sort of evidence-based research, talking with our colleagues in these countries to make sure that those things were practical for students to be able to improve, and that they translated simply and in a straightforward way for staff and students. For staff and colleagues. Yes, so it's not just for students, but also for adults, for parents. It's not one rule for one and one rule for the other. We really wanted a sort of holistic approach to it.
And when are we talking? When did that sort of come into fruition and you started to work on it?
So look, I joined just over a year ago, last end of April, beginning of May. We had a Global Be Well Day, which we'll talk a little bit later, I'm sure, about, which was a real celebration of well-being in all our schools. And then the work started after that. So it started last October. We launched it in January. Then COVID hit, but I was so pleased that we had it was established, if you like, in our schools before then, and we just built on it while we were all working remotely.
Well, obviously in some ways the perfect time, at least, because obviously, as we know, wellbeing is going to be another big thing of the coronavirus situation, and how everyone, not just pupils and students, but everyone has been affected. Just before we sort of really delve into that, maybe, how though have you in your role, and how do you support the schools and the teachers to roll this out further, to take what you're doing, these concepts, these ideas, and saying this is how we can help people, and actually make sure they can then do that when you're not there? They've got to then take it forward and deliver it. How do you sort of provide guidance? How do you feed back to them? How do they feed back to you? How is that whole process managed?
Yeah, as I said, it was helpful to have this common language, because that enables you to facilitate conversations between your colleagues. Because, my job is really just harnessing the power of this amazing collective group of colleagues from all over the world to make a real and lasting difference to their students. If I don't do that, and I'm trying to sort of, come up with everything, then I'm really missing a trick. And so by having that shared language, that enabled us on our various platforms. And we really utilize Teams, our use of Teams meetings and different groups to sort of share these ideas really took off during lockdown. And so it became a central focus. It also made it easier for schools, I hope, to be able to communicate with their parents about the key things that they were doing. Then every school will contribute to those 6 areas differently, and they are able to identify and say, look, actually we do loads on sleep, we do a whole area, blah blah blah. They might think, actually sleep is something we could talk more to parents about, or this is an area that our parents are saying they're finding difficult, and then they would, it's a two-way conversation. They would inform our resources. So if we're getting feedback from our schools via, we have a Be Well address, email address that colleagues would email us and ask for different things. So it's very much a two-way process. So yes, we give them that structure, but we use use our colleagues to share resources, and we respond to things that they are asking for, and things that they are doing in their schools to sort of really focus on these things.
And that element of them having the interpretation maybe of the sort of ideals that you're promoting, I presume that's quite an important thing, like I say, both in terms of, so they have a sense of ownership and not that they're being dictated to, but also in terms of them understanding that, like you were saying, in some parts of the world, certain things might translate differently or might be interpreted differently or might land better with
Yes,
parents.
of course. Yes, absolutely. I think one of the things that helps is when I joined Cognita, the leadership was really clearly and totally committed to wellbeing. It wasn't a sort of tokenistic thing. I never felt, the boss is just saying this because that's the right thing to say. Our CEO, Chris Jansen, and Simon Camby's our Director of Education, it came from them all the time. It was absolutely, that drive and vision went through everything. So it started there. Every region has their own CEO. It's filters down there into the head teachers, into the schools, into the colleagues. So I think that it's consistent. The messaging is consistent across everything, and there's not a separation of this is well-being and this is education. It's all an all of the same thing. You can't learn if your well-being is suffering, and that acceptance across the board. And you think it's remarkable, really, when you think of how many different schools you have across all these countries. I'm sure if I was trying to implement a new math syllabus, I might have, considerably more difficulty achieving that unity. But honestly, that wasn't a difficult part of the role.
And we've touched on this, but you said about coronavirus, and obviously that, we can maybe talk a bit more. Obviously, of all the years to sort of really implement a wellbeing strategy and deliver it, how did it go ultimately? Was it very helpful to people? Did you really see it coming into the fore of, like, actually that was sometimes maybe the bigger focus of what school had to become rather than education during those, and particularly the early weeks of lockdown and remote teaching when things was so strange?
Yeah, Dan, we looked at actually from it came first. So the first thing was, look, we didn't know how long it was going to last then, of course, but if you look at anything like a huge change, it is going to have an impact on those contributors. So the first message was, make sure you sleep, make sure you're getting your exercise in, make sure you have your boundaries around your screen, and all those sorts of key things came first. The other things came after that. So I think by really setting out the stall early, that was helpful, because we kept revisiting it. And of course it was an issue for lots of people, particularly the sleep was difficult. You're in the house all the time. Some of our colleagues were in flats, but it was helpful because what was happening perhaps in a flat in Madrid was the same as happening in a flat in Vietnam. You might have a new teacher who was only in their first year, they hadn't really met all their colleagues properly, and yet they could seek solace in other colleagues from around the world struggling with the same sort of thing. So it really helped from that point of view, having a sort of shared experience. And it also, I think when you're on your own, we were able to work on projects that, if I'm honest, I probably wouldn't have thought were possible beforehand. We did a huge Cognita home games, which involved all our schools, or almost all our schools, I should say. And if you'd have said to me beforehand, well, you can do that from your bedroom, I would have said, oh, there's no way I can do that from a bedroom. I need to visit all these places to be able to do that. And so, I think there was an openness and a willingness to share and learn from each other. And we were in a fortunate position, well, obviously not for Asia, it wasn't fortunate, but for all the colleagues that were not in Asia were able to learn from Asia because they were in lockdown before everybody else. So some of our schools in Hong Kong, for example, it was from January. And so learning from each other was a huge part of that.
Okay, that's very interesting. And when you talk about enabling things to do things you didn't think you could do or wouldn't have thought about before, and you mentioned these home games, I mean, what did they entail then? What did that enable you to do for everyone?
Well, literally, I happened to join on a conversation of some PE teachers that were talking about it being a shame that the various sports days and so on had been cancelled. And so we got together and started thinking of some challenges that we could put out there to get children, encouraging them to keep fit while they were at home, and some of them weren't able to leave the house. And so we came up with a series of challenges, and then it sort of snowballed. We had colleagues. We did an opening and closing ceremony in the same way you might do for the Olympics. So we had people from Brazil and Chile leading the way there because they were so wonderfully musical and rhythmical. And then we had, various sporting elite stars, promoting it and saying, come on, get active and get busy. And we started involving the parents, and in the end we had, I think it was 67 of our schools, and some of them, bearing in mind, were on holiday at that point, so 67 of our schools joined in, getting all their students to be able to do the plank or sit-ups or press-ups or whatever it was for a minute. And it was just such a feel-good event that actually got people active as well. So in terms of our charter, it was connecting people and getting them active, and it made us all laugh as well. So it was just a wonderful event. And I think there's something really empowering about knowing that there's somebody, in Rio doing your sit-ups or your plank challenge in the same way as if you might be doing it, in Switzerland or in Spain or in the UK. So it was really lovely.
And on the other end of the spectrum, maybe, I think they think like that, we saw a lot of that happening in terms of people like coming together and keeping active, and which was great. How did you also provide for the people that did struggle more, maybe, or whether that was teachers or pupils or even parents, if you heard about? How did the network that you have and the sort of resources that you were providing and so forth, did you see that coming to the fore and helping people get through the time, which was quite challenging for them?
Yeah, and you mentioned 3 groups of people, and I think they were all had different challenges. And I think number one thing was we were listening and asking the questions. For students, all the schools were just brilliant at they had set times where they would have check-ins with their students. If there were things in particular that they wanted additional help from, we would share through our team's resource, and that was really helpful. As I said, you could learn from some of our other schools. Staff, we would have what we called a Be Well Wednesday, and that was just a sort of weekly reminder and a focus about the importance of well-being. And we would we used a clinical psychologist, Dr. Bill Mitchell, who give little talks and little sort of tips to help colleagues in some of the things they were finding difficult. We put all our resources for parents, bearing in mind, in some areas there were parents working with 2 or 3 children in a flat and trying to do their job, and it was just very difficult. So we would put sort of tips and videos, and they're all on our website. They're open source for anybody at cognita.com, Be Well section. Just go and look there. So we did really try to cater for all 3 groups, because we all work together at the end of the day. It's not sort of one or the other, it's a sort of partnership.
And you mentioned you touched on research there, and obviously you said at the start that you yourself did further sort of academic qualification to understand more about this arena. How important do you think it is then to sort of have that grounding in those sort of fundamentals of research in this area, so that you may have a fun event or something, or you may be offering a quick way for someone to contact you, but actually underpinning it, there is a sort of a deep level of academic, rigor to it all?
Yeah, look, it's important. For me, certainly it was important that I had some evidence based to some of the things that you were talking about or promoting, particularly in the digital age, because things were changing so quickly for young people. But actually, sometimes I think there's too much pressure on teachers to, be a counsellor or be a psychologist or psychiatrist. That's not their role, but they can actually contribute to well-being. So if anything, it was not sort of saying, well, actually, you need to learn all about anxiety or depression or OCD, and you need to know the ins and outs. It's actually about stripping it back and thinking, let's be more proactive. If we got these things right on a more fundamental level for all students and earlier, there may be fewer children who might need that specialist help. And so that way, it takes a bit of the burden, which sometimes falls very heavily on 1 or 2 members of staff in a school, and spreads it more widely. Look, some school, lots of our schools in Asia have counsellors within the school, and that's great, but lots of schools don't have that. So yes, it's important, and there is such an interest from colleagues to learn more, and that's why it's really nice to share evidence, because if you're saying to parents it's really important that your child doesn't take the device to bed overnight, they want to know why, and you need to be able to tell them why and explain why. What does the science say? So yes, that's important, but it has to be a whole school contribution. And I think colleagues all want, everybody wants to think, well, what can I do to help well-being? You don't have to be an expert. There are little things you could do contribute to those 6 areas that will benefit children.
Do you think, though, that if maybe like looking longer term, as this, again, like well-being as a concept becomes so much more embedded in schools, and I'm not just talking about Cognita, I mean globally,
all schools.
If people are going to do that, do you not need someone that ultimately who is trained in the school, who can actually properly assess a pupil or a member of staff if they come to them with a problem and they're willing to go through that door and say, look, I need help. If they haven't got someone they can turn to, do you think that's something that does need to become more embedded in schools if that's truly going to deliver on that well-being ideal?
I think if you have a culture that promotes well-being, you will identify much more quickly if somebody is struggling. It's not the teacher's job then to identify what the problem is, or to try and be the sort of psychologist, the psychiatrist there. It is their job to point them in the right direction of whoever that is in that school, and it will be different in all schools. So I think if you've got a really open culture and you know what you're looking for, students who are flourishing, staff who are flourishing and feel content. If they don't feel content and they're not able to improve their well-being by working on some of these contributors, and it really can sometimes be as simple as, I actually haven't done any exercise, I haven't got outside the front door for however long. But if they've done all that and they're still feeling not well, or they're very low, then your role is not to sort it out for them, but to signpost them and support them in getting that help that they need. So I think having that sort of culture in a school is really important, and there are different ways that you can do that. Lots of schools have wonderful staff committees, and I think by just having that regular focus on well-being, it's just like that drop, that sort of reminder that you have to prioritize it. So I think that's one way. For our students, we have been using AS tracking now in the majority of our schools have started, and that's a well-being, again, a sort of preventative, proactive tool that looks at student biases and whether that might predispose them to certain vulnerabilities, and that's a proactive thing, and again, that's part of the culture, but it very much never says, well, then you have to solve mental health challenges and conditions, because that is very much a specialist area that I think needs help. So in short, yes, of course it helps to have as much information and evidence-based research to support your colleagues as you can, but they are ultimately not the final person who should help get specialist support to colleagues.
Okay, and if we take that idea then that the culture is in some ways is the sort of bedrock of a good well-being focus, and everything can sort of grow from there. Again, you've talked about some of the things that you've come up with to help schools do that. I mean, do you fundamentally though, do you know it's happening? Do you get good sense from the schools you work with that this is being taken on board and delivered and developed, and they're buying into it? Do you have a sense of any resistance or any sense of, oh yeah, it's a tough job, it shouldn't be easy kind of mindset? How can you gauge that to actually know that what you do in the centre is landing in the classrooms thousands of miles away?
Yeah, well, of course, and that's the most important thing, so you have to have these networks of communication, which has been made much easier through COVID, because that is the only way that we could communicate. But we have, I should say, a global Be Well Day, which is an annual day every year that celebrates and showcases to parents. I think often, not parents don't always realise all the brilliant things that schools are doing, and so it's really important to do that. But we took on board some of the feedback that said last year. They said, well, we really want to make sure that it's embedded every day. And so the challenge this year, for example, is a month-long challenge to get active and trying to amass as many kilometres as you can, so you can travel from one country to another country that's got a school in, and it builds that connection, and it's actually building healthier habits. But it also is about we've got a Be Well calendar where every month we focus not only on the contributors but also on major international global days of well-being. So Mental Health Awareness Month is next month. That will be a focus for us. We will try to get some experts that can shed a different perspective on that. So it's not sort of just come from us. It's actually come from experts in those fields. In Safer Internet Month, for example, in February, again, we'll do a similar sort of thing. So it's about having a regular monthly reminder of a key issue, and for our staff having a weekly reminder about how important it is, because it really is that sort of drip feed that will get there in the end, I think.
Yeah. And looking back over your career on the long term, is that something where you feel like in the past maybe there wasn't enough of that, where it was too much like once a term or once a year, and then, well, no wonder people sort of forgot about it, whereas when you have it more regularly, it becomes part of school life in the way that anything else that happens regularly just becomes another part of school life?
Yeah. I think it should be part of school life. I think it should be across the board. It shouldn't just be one person's job. Yes, one person will oversee it. I'm sure in a school, obviously the pastoral leads in various schools would drive that. But there could be any number of colleagues that might say, oh, look, we can do that. The PE department can lead on that, or the head of charities are going to lead on that. So there are all sorts of colleagues that will contribute to it. So I think if it really is embedded from the start, so for when colleagues join a school, it's like, this is what we're about. Well-being goes first, then the learning goes on that, because you can't have cognitive learning without social and emotional learning. It's so intertwined. And so I think it is all about spreading it across all colleagues. It used to be very much, when we used to have health educare, PSHE in this country, in other countries it would be called personal health care, or whatever else it would be termed in the different countries. The concept was almost about who teaches that. Very few countries have a sort of specialist PGC curriculum where teacher training is just in that area, and so it relies on teacher goodwill, and sometimes they feel ill-equipped to do that. And so I think if there's a broader expectation that all teachers contribute to it, it makes it more culturally impactful, but B, it takes that sort of pressure off one person.
Yeah, that certainly makes a lot of sense. And something you said there that sort of triggered a thought is, again, we're talking about well-being and good mental health, which again is something that's grown massively in awareness over the last few years. And I suppose, would the hope be then, through what you've described there and the various events and so forth, that well-being becomes something that everyone is thinking about, both the pupils and the staff, not just in school as a school thing, but something that they can take into their everyday life, and particularly with students into their later life, so that they understand what good well-being is, and actually can spot if they suddenly think, I'm struggling at the moment in life, for whatever reason, but they're actually more attuned to it, like a skill, like learning maths is a skill, and so forth. Is that the sort of is that the ultimate goal we're going for here?
That's exactly it. That we start from when they are very small, from when they first come into reception. We look at all the key areas. They're just as relevant to a 3-year-old as they are to a 33-year-old or a 63-year-old, and they don't change. And that's the beauty of it. So I think by starting from when they're young, reinforcing it, you hope that when they go to university, and that it's interesting that so many mental health conditions begin, 50% before the age of 14 and 75% before the age of 24. They've gone to university, often left on their own or to the workplace. And if they haven't got the tools just to say, I'm struggling a little bit, I haven't even got a clue where to start, then that's doing them a real disservice. And as I said, they're not going to be able to learn anything. So if they really believe, I have to get these 6 things right, then I shall be able to learn, then I'll be able to look after myself, and they will thrive then. And I think that goes across all our schools, no matter what culture it is, no matter what, what group of parents or students or staff. And I think staff, it's important for them too, because if we don't look after our well-being as educators, then we're really not much of a role model as a parent or as a teacher. And I'm sure we've all know of times when, as a parent, you've shouted at your children, or you're cross, or you haven't been, because you're tired, or because you're hungry, or because whatever else it is, you haven't even addressed the fundamental needs, your fundamental needs, and therefore you can't look after them so well.
And on that ideal then of like how we can model it, is there any sort of final advice then, or sort of ideas you'd give for teachers or indeed parents who want to take these ideas further and do better? And because bearing in mind that some listeners might not be in a big school group, or there might be it might be that in their school this is not something that's got a sole responsibility, and as a result it sort of is a bit nebulous still. Is there any sort of thing you'd recommend, like here's how you can really bring it to the fore so it becomes a core focus in a sort of, not in a simple way, but in a way that's actually achievable?
I think if you were in a without any sort of other schools to lean upon, although I would say please take the resources there for you. Pick one or two things. Sleep is probably the most fundamentally important basis to your health. And so if they started with that and said, every one of our teachers, so every time I see my children, I'm going to mention sleep. I'm going to say how well I slept. I'm going to give them some top tips. You are contributing to one element of well-being, and you're improving that for them. And as that varies, it will. But funny enough, even though it varies, we did a Sleepy Simon. The story began Sleepy Simon for little ones, and we took it to Asia. We said, would this sort of story work for you? They said, we'll need to change a few bits and bobs because they don't have many. They were saying not many of our children have dogs, for example. Things you wouldn't really think of, and the same happened in Latin America. But the concept was the same, and it was just that the teacher in their own classroom with their little students would talk about sleep with their own, and they would make an impact and a difference to those children. So I think for a teacher feeling empowered that just because they can't change everything, just pick one or two elements about well-being that you can contribute to, something that you perhaps have an affinity about, or you really sort of connect with, and really try and make small steps like that. And I think that will help.
Yeah. So take something and just sort of, rather than trying to do it all at once as a big sort of blockbuster change, it's more like, okay, something small and gradual, but 6 months, a year later, suddenly you've done that.
Yeah, you've done it, and it will snowball, because then the teacher, the class next door might say, oh, that's quite good. Can I have that resource? Or the parents might say, oh, actually, we're seeing it, but now my little child, and we had this actually, we had children saying they were nagging their parents to tell them, well, you put your phone in your bedroom overnight, and might be a bit annoying if you're a parent, but at least it was, the penny was dropping, and therefore you're making a small difference. So I think if you just think, it's not going to happen by itself, I can make a little difference. There are always things that you can learn more about. And I think most of us now are realizing the importance of it to us and to other people. So we want to share. And I think I would encourage anyone who's interested in well-being just to take that first step to change something.
That's great. I think that's a really nice sort of positive, simple and actionable point to leave it on. So, thank you very much for your insights and sharing, all the work you're up to. It sounds really interesting. And we'll look forward to speaking again in the future, perhaps.
Oh, thanks, Dan. Lovely to speak to you.